The sirens were screaming down my quiet street. 3 patrol cars, an ambulance, and half my neighborhood gathered on the sidewalk, staring at my house like I was some kind of criminal. Sheriff Karen stood there in her pressed uniform, pointing at my backyard pool with the kind of authority that makes your blood run cold. She was telling the paramedics about a dangerous safety violation that required immediate emergency response. I watched from my front door as she gestured wildly at my pool safety locks, the same locks that I had installed according to every fire code in the book, the same codes that I enforced every single day in my job. That was when I realized Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. My name is Michael Torres, and for the past 12 years I have served as fire marshal for our county. It is a job that requires precision, knowledge of safety codes, and the ability to make decisions that can save lives. I take that responsibility seriously, which is why my own home reflects the same attention to detail that I bring to every inspection. Our neighborhood sits on the quiet side of town where oak trees line the streets and neighbors still wave when they drive past. My house is nothing fancy, but I am proud of what my wife Sarah and I have built together. The backyard is where we spend most of our time during the summer months. Our pool area has become the gathering place for family barbecues and birthday parties. The pool itself was installed 3 years ago after we saved up enough money to do it right. I made sure every aspect met or exceeded safety standards. The fencing, the drainage, the electrical work, all of it was done by licensed professionals who knew I would inspect their work with the same scrutiny I applied to commercial properties. Sarah loves to host pool parties for our kids and their friends. Our daughter Emma just turned 15, and our son Jake is 12. Watching them laugh and play in that crystal blue water makes all the extra safety precautions worth it. I installed motion sensors, proper lighting, and non-slip surfaces around the entire perimeter. The neighbors have always been friendly and respectful. The Johnsons next door have lived there for 20 years and often join us for evening conversations over the fence. Mrs. Peterson across the street brings us tomatoes from her garden every summer. It is the kind of place where people look out for each other. That peaceful atmosphere changed when Sheriff Karen moved into the house 2 doors down. She arrived about 6 months ago in a moving truck that blocked half the street for an entire day. I introduced myself like I do with all new neighbors, but there was something about her handshake that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. Karen wore her sheriff uniform even when she was just getting her mail or working in her yard. She carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that screamed authority, even during casual conversations. When she spoke, her voice had an edge that made simple questions sound like interrogations. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Law enforcement is a stressful job, and maybe she just needed time to adjust to civilian life when she was off duty. But as the weeks passed, I noticed she spent a lot of time watching the neighborhood from her front window. Not in a friendly way, but like she was looking for problems that needed solving. The decision to install additional safety locks came after I noticed more children playing in the neighborhood. The Martinez family had moved in across the street with 3 young kids, and the Hendersons 2 blocks over had been letting their grandchildren visit more often during the summer. As fire marshal, I knew the statistics about pool accidents and drowning incidents. Even with proper fencing and supervision, additional safety measures could prevent tragedies. The locks I chose were commercial grade, the same type I recommended for public facilities and apartment complexes. I spent my Saturday morning installing the new safety mechanisms on the pool gate and emergency access points. Each lock was positioned according to manufacturer specifications and local safety codes. The installation manual was spread across my patio table, along with my personal copy of the fire safety regulations. The work was going smoothly when I noticed Sheriff Karen walking across her front yard toward my fence. She was wearing casual clothes, but she carried herself with the same authoritative bearing that made her presence feel official even on her day off. "Looks like a big project you have going on over there," she called out from her side of the fence. I looked up from the lock mechanism I was adjusting and wiped the sweat from my forehead. "Just adding some extra safety features. Better to be overprepared than sorry." Karen stepped closer to the fence line and peered over at my work area. Her eyes moved from the locks to the instruction manual to the tools spread across the table. "Those look pretty heavy-duty for a residential pool." "They meet all the current safety standards," I explained. "Actually exceed them in most cases. I like to follow the same protocols I use in my professional work." Her expression shifted slightly, and I could see her studying the locks more carefully. "What kind of professional work is that?" "Fire marshal for the county. I inspect commercial properties and make sure they comply with safety codes." Something changed in Karen's posture when I mentioned my job title. She stood a little straighter, and her voice took on a more official tone. "Fire marshal, huh? Well, I hope you are making sure those locks do not interfere with any neighborhood regulations." I paused in my work and looked at her directly. "What regulations would those be?" "Oh, there are all kinds of rules about property modifications and safety equipment in residential areas. As sheriff, I deal with these issues more often than you might think." The conversation was taking an odd turn, but I tried to remain friendly. "I am familiar with most of the relevant codes in my professional capacity. These installations are well within legal limits." Karen nodded, but her smile did not reach her eyes. "I am sure you think they are, but sometimes people get so focused on their own expertise that they miss the bigger picture." She walked back toward her house without another word, leaving me standing there with a wrench in my hand and a growing sense that I had just been warned about something. The pleasant Saturday morning suddenly felt less peaceful. I finished installing the locks and tested each mechanism twice to make sure everything functioned properly. As I packed up my tools, I noticed Karen watching from her front window. When our eyes met, she did not wave or acknowledge me in any way. That night at dinner, I told Sarah about the conversation with our new neighbor. She listened while cutting vegetables for a salad and shook her head when I finished the story. "She sounds like the type of person who needs to control everything around her," Sarah said. "Hopefully, she will mind her own business once she gets settled." I hoped my wife was right, but something about Karen's parting comment bothered me. The way she had said "bigger picture" felt like a threat wrapped in friendly advice. 3 days later, Karen returned to my property. This time she was not dressed casually, and she was not making friendly conversation over the fence. She stood at my front door in her full sheriff uniform, complete with badge, gun belt, and the kind of official bearing that transforms neighbors into law enforcement encounters. I opened the door to find her holding a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone conducting official business. The friendly pretense from our first meeting had completely disappeared. "Mr. Torres, I need to discuss some concerns about your recent property modifications," she announced before I could even say hello. "What concerns would those be, Sheriff?" Karen consulted her clipboard like she was reading from an official report. "I have received multiple complaints about the safety locks you installed on your pool area. They appear to violate several neighborhood regulations regarding property appearance and emergency access." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. I am not aware of any regulations that would prohibit residential pool safety equipment. Could you show me the specific codes you are referencing? Mr. Torres, I do not think you understand the seriousness of this situation. Those locks create a potential hazard for emergency responders. If there was a fire or medical emergency, first responders might not be able to access your backyard quickly enough. The irony of her statement hit me immediately. As fire marshal, I had written protocols for emergency pool area access. The locks I installed actually improved response times by providing multiple secured entry points for authorized personnel. Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but those locks are designed specifically for emergency situations. They have bypass mechanisms that allow first responders to access the area immediately with standard equipment. Karen's expression hardened. Mr. Torres, I am not here to debate the technical specifications of your equipment. I am here to inform you that you have 48 hours to remove those locks or face potential legal action. Legal action for what exactly? Violation of neighborhood safety standards, failure to comply with residential building codes, and creation of a public hazard. She flipped through pages on her clipboard like she was reading from an official citation. I could feel my patience running thin. Sheriff, with all due respect, I am the fire marshal for this county. I am very familiar with the building codes and safety standards you are referencing. The equipment I installed meets or exceeds every relevant requirement. Being fire marshal does not give you the right to ignore local regulations, Mr. Torres. In fact, it means you should be setting a better example for the community. The conversation was spiraling into absurdity, but Karen seemed completely convinced of her authority in the matter. I tried one more time to approach it reasonably. Could you provide me with copies of the specific regulations you believe I am violating? I would be happy to review them and make any necessary adjustments. Karen snapped the clipboard against her side and took a step closer to my door. Mr. Torres, I am not going to stand here and justify my authority to you. You have 48 hours to comply with my directive. If you choose not to cooperate, I will be forced to take this matter to the next level. And what level would that be? Official complaint with the county, possible citation for code violations, and if necessary, emergency removal of the unsafe equipment. She turned and walked back toward her patrol car without waiting for my response. I watched her drive away, feeling like I had just been threatened by someone who had no legal ground to stand on, but enough authority to make my life difficult anyway. That evening, I called my colleague Jim Rodriguez, who works in the county inspector's office. I explained the situation and asked him to double-check the regulations Karen had referenced. Mike, there are no neighborhood regulations that would prohibit residential pool safety locks, Jim told me, especially not the commercial-grade equipment you installed. If anything, you are going above and beyond what is required. That is what I thought, but she seemed pretty confident about her authority in the matter. Sounds like someone is trying to flex their badge where it does not belong. You might want to document everything in case this escalates. I hung up the phone with a growing realization that Karen was not going to let this go easily. She had made it personal, and she was prepared to use her position as sheriff to win an argument she could not win on facts. I thought Karen might back down once she realized I was not going to be intimidated. I was wrong. 2 days later, she made good on her threat to escalate the situation, but not in any way I could have anticipated. I was working in my home office Thursday morning when I heard the first siren. Then another. By the time I reached my front window, 3 patrol cars were turning onto our street with lights flashing and radios crackling with urgent communication. My first thought was that someone in the neighborhood was having a medical emergency. Mrs. Peterson was in her 80s, and the Hendersons had teenage kids who sometimes made questionable decisions. I stepped outside to see if I could help with whatever crisis was unfolding. That was when I realized the emergency vehicles were stopping in front of my house. 2 paramedics jumped out of an ambulance and began unloading equipment from the back. A fire truck rounded the corner and pulled up behind the patrol cars. Within minutes, my quiet street looked like the scene of a major disaster. Sheriff Karen emerged from the lead patrol car and immediately began directing the emergency responders toward my backyard. She was pointing at my pool area and speaking with the kind of urgency reserved for life-threatening situations. I walked toward the growing crowd of officials, trying to understand what could possibly require this level of emergency response at my property. One of the paramedics approached me with a concerned expression. "Sir, are you the homeowner? We received a report of a dangerous safety violation that requires immediate attention." "What kind of safety violation?" Before the paramedic could answer, Karen appeared at my side. She was holding her radio and clipboard like she was coordinating a complex rescue operation. "Mr. Torres, I tried to handle this through proper channels, but you refused to cooperate. Now we have to address the safety hazard you created before someone gets hurt." Neighbors began emerging from their houses to see what was happening. I watched Mrs. Peterson shuffle across the street with her walker, while the Martinez children pressed their faces against their front window. The Johnson family stood on their porch with expressions of confusion and concern. "Sheriff, what exactly did you tell these people?" "I reported a residential safety violation that poses an immediate threat to public welfare. Those locks you installed are preventing emergency access to a potential drowning hazard." One of the responding officers, a young deputy I did not recognize, looked back and forth between Karen and me with growing confusion. "Sheriff, what exactly are we responding to here?" Karen led the group toward my backyard gate, speaking with the authoritative tone of someone briefing emergency personnel on a crisis situation. "The homeowner installed unauthorized safety equipment that blocks emergency access to this pool area. If someone was drowning, we would not be able to reach them quickly enough." I followed the group, watching in disbelief as Karen demonstrated how the safety locks worked. She struggled with the mechanisms for several minutes before finally admitting she could not figure out how to operate them. "See, these locks are too complicated for emergency situations. First responders need immediate access, not puzzle boxes that require special training to open." The fire captain, a man named Bill Morrison who I had worked with on several inspections, looked at the locks more carefully. He tested the emergency bypass mechanism and had the gate open in less than 10 seconds. "These are standard commercial safety locks," he told Karen. "Every emergency responder in the county is trained on this type of equipment." Karen's confident demeanor faltered slightly, but she pressed forward with her complaint. "Well, they still create an unnecessary barrier to emergency access. The homeowner is being stubborn about removing them despite multiple warnings." Captain Morrison looked at me with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand the real nature of this emergency call. "And you are." That was the moment everything changed. The moment when Karen's abuse of power was about to collide with reality in the most spectacular way possible. "I am Michael Torres," I said calmly, "County Fire Marshal." The silence that followed was deafening. Every emergency responder on scene turned to look at Karen with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed disbelief. The paramedics exchanged glances. The deputies shifted uncomfortably. Captain Morrison was the first to speak. "Sheriff, are you telling me you called in an emergency response for pool safety equipment installed by the fire marshal?" The revelation of my identity as fire marshal created an immediate shift in the entire dynamic of the situation. Karen's confident authority crumbled in real time as every emergency responder on scene began to understand the absurdity of what had just occurred. Captain Morrison looked at Karen with the kind of expression reserved for people who have just wasted everyone's time on a massive scale. "Sheriff, Fire Marshal Torres is the person who writes the safety protocols we follow. He inspects our equipment and approves our emergency response procedures." I watched Karen's face cycle through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, anger, and then something that looked like panic as the full implications of her mistake began to sink in. "Well, that does not change the fact that those locks violate neighborhood regulations," she said, but her voice had lost its authoritative edge. Deputy Williams, one of the officers who had responded to the call, stepped forward with his own clipboard. "Sheriff, what specific regulations are we talking about? I need to document this for my report." Karen fumbled with her paperwork, flipping through pages that suddenly seemed less official than they had a few minutes earlier. "There are numerous codes that apply to residential safety equipment. The homeowner needs to ensure compliance with all applicable standards." I decided it was time to end this charade before it went any further. "Sheriff, I am happy to provide you with copies of all the relevant safety codes that apply to residential pool equipment. I have them in my office, along with the installation certificates and inspection reports for this equipment." "That will not be necessary," Karen said quickly. Captain Morrison was not ready to let this go. "Actually, I think it would be very helpful. We need to understand what codes you believe are being violated so we can avoid similar calls in the future." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger as more people came outside to see what was happening. I could see them whispering among themselves and pointing at the various emergency vehicles. Mrs. Peterson had made it across the street and was talking to one of the paramedics about the situation. "Sheriff," I said calmly, "would you like me to explain how these safety locks actually improve emergency response times rather than hindering them?" Karen's jaw tightened. "Mr. Torres, your position as fire marshal does not give you the right to ignore local regulations or dismiss the concerns of law enforcement." "What local regulations specifically?" She waved her clipboard in frustration. "The regulations that govern residential property modifications and neighborhood safety standards." Deputy Williams cleared his throat. "Sheriff, could you provide me with the regulation numbers so I can include them in my incident report?" The silence stretched for several uncomfortable seconds. Karen looked around at the group of emergency responders, all of whom were waiting for her to produce the legal justification for this entire response. "The specific numbers are back at the office, but that does not change the fundamental issue here." Captain Morrison exchanged a look with Deputy Williams that spoke volumes about their assessment of the situation. "What fundamental issue would that be, Sheriff?" "The issue is that Mr. Torres installed equipment without proper consultation with local law enforcement. These decisions affect public safety, and they should be coordinated with all relevant agencies." I felt a surge of anger at her continued attempts to justify what was clearly an abuse of her authority. "Sheriff, I consult with law enforcement every day in my capacity as fire marshal. I work directly with your department on emergency response protocols and safety inspections. That is different. This is a residential matter that falls under neighborhood jurisdiction. Captain Morrison had heard enough. Sheriff, there is no such thing as neighborhood jurisdiction when it comes to fire safety codes. Fire Marshal Tours has authority over safety equipment throughout the county, including residential installations. The other emergency responders began packing up their equipment. It was becoming clear to everyone present that this was not a legitimate safety emergency, but rather a personal dispute that had gotten completely out of hand. Deputy Williams approached me with his notepad. Fire Marshal Tours, for my report, can you confirm that the safety equipment in question meets all applicable codes and regulations? Yes, it does. I can provide you with all the relevant documentation if needed. That would be helpful. Sheriff, do you want to add anything to the incident report? Karen looked around at the dissipating crowd of emergency responders and neighbors. Her moment of authority had collapsed entirely, leaving her standing in my driveway with no legal ground to stand on and no way to save face. No, she said tersely, I think we are done here. But we were not done. Not by a long shot. Karen had crossed a line when she called 911 and created a public spectacle over her personal vendetta. She had wasted taxpayer resources, embarrassed herself in front of the entire neighborhood, and abused her authority as sheriff. As the emergency vehicles began leaving my street, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time to hold Sheriff Karen accountable for her actions. After the emergency vehicles left and the neighbors slowly returned to their homes, Karen lingered in my driveway like someone who was not ready to admit defeat. I could see her trying to formulate a strategy to salvage what remained of her authority in the situation. Mr. Tours, she said as I was walking back toward my front door, I hope you understand that I was just trying to do my job. Public safety is my primary concern. I stopped and turned to face her. The time for polite conversation had passed. Sheriff, what you did here today was not about public safety. It was about personal control. That is not true. I have received complaints from other neighbors about your pool modifications. People are concerned about the appearance and the potential impact on property values. It was a new angle but just as unfounded as her previous claims. What neighbors? And what complaints specifically? Karen gestured vaguely toward the street. Multiple residents have expressed concerns. I cannot reveal their identities, but the complaints are legitimate. I looked around at the houses where my neighbors lived. Mrs. Peterson was still standing on her front porch, clearly listening to our conversation. The Martinez family was in their front yard, and Mr. Johnson was working in his garden. All of them had been friendly and supportive when I installed the safety equipment. Sheriff, if there were legitimate complaints, why did you not mention them during any of our previous conversations? Why did you focus solely on safety codes and emergency access? Her explanation was falling apart in real time, and she knew it. The complaints came in after our initial discussion. Sometimes these issues develop as people have more time to observe the changes. Mrs. Peterson had heard enough. She started walking across the street with her walker, moving faster than I had ever seen her move before. "Excuse me, Sheriff," Mrs. Peterson called out as she approached. "I could not help but overhear your conversation. I have lived on this street for 37 years, and I have never seen anyone work harder to make their property safe and beautiful than Michael Tours." Karen turned to face Mrs. Peterson with a forced smile. "Ma'am, I appreciate your input, but this is a matter of official policy. Official policy nothing, Mrs. Peterson said with the kind of directness that comes with age and experience. You have been nothing but trouble since you moved to this neighborhood, always watching everyone and looking for problems where none exist. I watched Karen's composure crack a little more as Mrs. Peterson continued her assessment. And another thing, Mrs. Peterson added, those pool locks he installed make perfect sense. My grandson visits every summer, and it gives me peace of mind knowing there are proper safety measures in place. Mr. Johnson had finished his gardening and was walking over to join the conversation. Is everything all right over here? I saw all the emergency vehicles earlier. Karen tried to regain control of the narrative. Just a routine safety inspection that got resolved. Routine safety inspection. Mr. Johnson looked confused. I have never seen a routine inspection that required 3 patrol cars and an ambulance. Mrs. Peterson laughed despite the tension of the situation. It was not routine anything. The sheriff here called 911 because she does not like Michael's pool locks. I could see the frustration building in Karen's expression as more neighbors became involved in the conversation. Her attempt at damage control was backfiring spectacularly. There seems to be some misunderstanding about the nature of today's response, Karen said. I was following proper protocol for addressing potential safety violations. Mr. Johnson looked at me with raised eyebrows. Safety violations. Mike, you are the fire marshal. If anyone knows about safety, it would be you. The absurdity of the situation was becoming apparent to everyone except Karen herself. She continued trying to justify her actions, even as the evidence mounted against her. Being fire marshal does not exempt anyone from following neighborhood standards and community guidelines, she insisted. What neighborhood standards? Mr. Johnson asked. We do not have any standards about pool equipment. The Homeowners Association dissolved 15 years ago. That was news to me, but it explained why Karen had been so vague about the specific regulations she claimed I was violating. There were no neighborhood regulations because there was no active neighborhood association to create them. Karen realized she had been caught in another contradiction. Her damage control efforts were only making things worse by highlighting how little factual basis she had for any of her claims. I think this conversation has gone on long enough, she said. Mr. Torres, I expect you to consider the concerns that have been raised and act accordingly. She walked back toward her house without waiting for a response, leaving me standing in my driveway with 2 neighbors who had just witnessed a spectacular display of authoritarian overreach. Michael, Mrs. Peterson said once Karen was out of earshot, you need to do something about her. This will not be the last time she causes problems for people in this neighborhood. I had reached the same conclusion. Karen had shown that she was willing to abuse her authority as sheriff to settle personal disputes. Today it was my pool locks. Tomorrow it could be something much more serious. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, documenting everything that had happened from the first conversation with Karen to the emergency response spectacle in my driveway. Sarah sat across from me, occasionally asking questions about details that seemed important for the official record. You really think this is worth pursuing formally? She asked as I finished writing the timeline of events. I think it has to be pursued formally. She wasted county resources, made false reports, and used her position as sheriff to harass a neighbor over a personal disagreement. If I let this slide, what happens to the next person she decides to target? The next morning, I drove to the county administration building and requested a meeting with Sheriff Karen's supervisor, Captain David Martinez. I had worked with Captain Martinez on several fire safety inspections, and he had always struck me as a fair and professional leader. Captain Martinez listened to my account without interruption, occasionally taking notes and asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples like he was developing a headache. "Mike, I have to tell you, this is not the first complaint we have received about Sheriff Karen's conduct. There have been several incidents where citizens felt she overstepped her authority or used her position inappropriately." "What kind of incidents?" "Traffic stops that turned into property searches without probable cause. Noise complaints where she threatened arrest for non-criminal activities. A few cases where she showed up at people's homes in uniform to address personal disputes." Captain Martinez opened a file folder and showed me several incident reports. The pattern was clear. Karen had been using her badge and authority to intimidate people who disagreed with her or failed to comply with her personal preferences. The problem is that most people do not want to file formal complaints against law enforcement. They are afraid of retaliation, or they think it will not make a difference. "But I am filing a formal complaint." "Yes, you are. And because you are a county employee with your own law enforcement authority, your complaint carries significant weight. It also helps that you documented everything and there were multiple witnesses to the emergency response incident." Captain Martinez explained the process for investigating complaints against Sheriff Department personnel. There would be an internal review, interviews with witnesses, and a formal hearing if the evidence supported disciplinary action. "I want you to know that we take these matters seriously," he said. "Law enforcement authority comes with tremendous responsibility, and officers who abuse that authority undermine public trust in all of us." While the formal complaint process was getting started, word about the incident began spreading through the community. Mrs. Peterson had apparently shared the story with her weekly bridge club, and Mr. Johnson had mentioned it to several people at the hardware store. By the end of the week, I was getting phone calls from neighbors I barely knew, all of them sharing their own experiences with Sheriff Karen's behavior. Tom Bradley, who lived 3 streets over, called to tell me about Karen showing up at his house in uniform to complain about his dog barking. She threatened to cite me for noise violations and said she would have animal control take my dog if I did not keep him quiet. But my dog barely barks, and I have never had complaints from my actual neighbors. Lisa Chen, who owned a small restaurant downtown, described how Karen had demanded free meals in exchange for security services that nobody had requested. She would sit in my dining room for hours, making customers uncomfortable, and then expect not to pay for her food. When I asked her to pay like everyone else, she started finding health code violations that did not exist. The most disturbing call came from Janet Williams, an elderly woman who lived alone on the outskirts of town. Sheriff Karen came to my house claiming someone had reported suspicious activity. She searched my property without my permission and questioned me for over an hour about my daily routine. I felt like a criminal in my own home. Each conversation revealed the same pattern. Karen used her authority as sheriff to control and intimidate people who could not fight back effectively. She targeted citizens who were unlikely to complain or who lacked the resources to challenge her behavior. I compiled all of these accounts and forwarded them to Captain Martinez as additional evidence for the investigation. The complaint I had filed was no longer just about my pool locks. It had become about a pattern of abuse that affected the entire community. Local media picked up the story after someone leaked details about the emergency response to Karen's false report. The headline in the county newspaper read, "Sheriff calls 911 over fire marshal's pool locks." The article included quotes from several neighbors and highlighted the waste of emergency resources. Karen's response to the media attention was predictably defensive. She issued a statement claiming that her actions were justified by legitimate safety concerns and that she was being unfairly targeted by people who did not understand law enforcement procedures. But the damage was done. The community had seen behind the curtain of her authority, and they did not like what they found. More complaints were filed with the sheriff's department. The county commissioners began asking questions about police conduct and oversight. Karen had miscalculated badly when she decided to target me. Instead of intimidating someone into submission, she had picked a fight with someone who had the knowledge, resources, and community standing to hold her accountable. The investigation was moving forward, and justice was finally within reach. The internal investigation took 6 weeks to complete, but the outcome was everything I had hoped for and more. Captain Martinez called me on a Friday afternoon to inform me that the review board had found Sheriff Karen guilty of multiple violations of department policy and professional conduct standards. The evidence was overwhelming, Captain Martinez explained. Your complaint, combined with the additional reports from other citizens, painted a clear picture of someone who consistently abused her authority for personal reasons. Karen was terminated from her position effective immediately. She would lose her law enforcement certification and would be prohibited from working in any police capacity within the state. The county also agreed to implement additional training and oversight procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. But the consequences extended beyond just losing her job. The district attorney's office decided to pursue criminal charges for filing false reports and misuse of emergency services. Karen faced potential fines and community service for the waste of taxpayer resources during her manufactured emergency at my property. More importantly, the investigation had exposed a culture of inadequate oversight that allowed officers like Karen to operate without proper accountability. The county commissioners ordered a comprehensive review of all sheriff department policies and procedures. The day after Karen's termination was announced, I received a visit from Mrs. Peterson, Mr. Johnson, and several other neighbors. They came to thank me for taking action and to celebrate the restoration of peace to our community. "You did what needed to be done," Mrs. Peterson said as we sat on my back patio overlooking the pool area that had started this entire conflict. Someone had to stand up to her. Mr. Johnson raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "To Michael Torres, the fire marshal who put out more than just fires." We all laughed, but the moment carried deeper significance. Karen's removal had created a sense of relief that extended far beyond our immediate neighborhood. People felt safer walking their dogs, working in their yards, and going about their daily lives without worrying about arbitrary harassment from someone in uniform. The pool locks that had triggered Karen's initial complaint remained exactly where I had installed them. They continued to provide the safety and security I had intended, and they had been officially recognized as meeting all applicable codes and regulations. Sarah and I hosted a neighborhood barbecue that weekend to celebrate the resolution of the situation. Nearly 20 families attended, including several people who had been afraid to speak up during Karen's reign of intimidation. The atmosphere was festive and relaxed in a way that our street had not experienced in months. As I stood by the grill, watching children play safely in the pool while their parents enjoyed conversation and laughter, I reflected on the lessons learned from this experience. Authority without accountability is dangerous, regardless of the uniform or badge that comes with it. People in positions of power who abuse that power must be held responsible for their actions. But I also learned about the strength of community when people come together to support what is right. Mrs. Peterson's courage in speaking up, Mr. Johnson's willingness to get involved, and the testimony of other citizens had been crucial in building the case against Karen's misconduct. The story had a satisfying ending, but it also served as a reminder that vigilance is required to protect the rights and freedoms we often take for granted. Officers like Karen exist in communities everywhere, using their authority to control and intimidate rather than serve and protect. 3 months later, I received a letter from the new sheriff who had been appointed to replace Karen. He thanked me for my service to the community and assured me that his department would operate with the highest standards of professionalism and accountability. My pool locks remained in place, my family continued to enjoy our backyard gatherings, and our neighborhood returned to the peaceful, friendly place it had been before Karen's brief but destructive tenure. Justice had been served, and the community was stronger for having stood up to abuse of power.